Thank you, everyone, for joining me for these live internet studies week after week. My name is Ariel Ben Lyman Hanavi. I conduct these studies live insofar as if you're joining me via Teams each week, Saturday evenings, USA time, then if you've got Teams at that moment, you're welcome to join me. Go to my website at tasteoftorah.com, and usually there's a big yellow banner that shows along the very, very top of any page. And click that and scroll down to the page and you'll see details about joining the live studies. It's an hour and a half long. It's broken up into two segments. The first segment is Eschatology, a biblical study of end-time events. We talk about end-time prophecies, things like that. The second study is 30 minutes long. It's entitled A Trinitarian Response to Biblical Unitarianism. It's a kind of an ongoing mock debate between me, a biblical Trinitarian, and my imaginary opponent, which exist in real life, but they're not here in live debate with me, the biblical Unitarians, non-Trinitarian Christians. So if those are topics that you enjoy, stick around for both. Let's jump right into the first topic. Eschatology, a biblical study of end-time events. We're in topic 12, Rapture's Views, a Final Analysis. I was teasing myself last week that it feels like we've been in this forever. My other students also are kind of teasing me. Wow, we've been in this thing for a year. I decided I'd go back and check. We've only been in it for 5 months. Topic 12, but it feels longer because the previous two topics, Rapture Views and Overview, topic 10, and Making a Case for the Prewrath View, topic 11, they were all talking about comparing different rapture views. And so if you want to say this comparison of rapture views feels like we've been in it for a year, I think we have been in that for longer, because if you go back to topic 10, then yeah. But nevertheless, we are starting to wind down. We're in the final stages of talking about rapture, so we can jump into a different topic called Mystery Babylon. So what we're looking at right now is this excursus that I put together where I was defending the Prewrath interpretation of Yeshua's Olivet Discourse from the pre-tribbers perspective that the church is absent from the 7-year time frame that they call the tribulation. So we're going to jump into this excursus and talk about how the church being raptured in the time frame that we're talking about, the 7th week of Daniel, we're going to talk about eventually the church being raptured connects Israel's covenant calling with all those who are in Messiah. Meaning, I believe that the pre-tribbers do a disservice to the body of Messiah by describing the rapture as completely disconnected from events that they describe as second coming, meaning Israel's salvation. And the separation of the church's salvation from the salvation of Israel by 7 years, I believe is it does a disservice to Christians. It number one, it disconnects us from our brother Israelites, those whom we've been grafted into per Paul's teachings. But number two, it also causes scriptural passages that talk about events of the end times to suffer from some type of like amnesia, some disconnection, from some confusion, some inability to connect all the dots, some discontinuity. That's the word I was looking for earlier. So we're going to look at that excursus in a moment. Let me turn first to the 4 views of the rapture that I'm going to be bouncing back and forth from. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. The first view that I usually discuss is the the pre-trib rapture itself. Their rapture is at the very beginning of what they label the 7-year tribulation. I disagree with that label, 7-year tribulation. I do agree with a 7-year time frame. I just don't think all of it needs to be identified as tribulation. But they've got a pre-trib rapture at the beginning, and their second coming, which is Israel's salvation, basically, is at the very end. Pre-trib rapturists believe the church will be raptured before this final 7-year period known as Daniel's 70th week. That's essentially their view. The second view that's open for discussion is what's called the mid-trib rapture. Mid-trib rapture places their rapture right in the middle of that 7-year time frame. Their second coming is at the far end of that 7-year time frame. Mid-trib rapturists believe that the rapture will occur halfway through the 7-year period, just before the beginning of their great tribulation, of the great tribulation. The third one on, already did that one. The third one on my list is the post-trib rapture. This one gains in popularity more and more every day. The post-trib rapture is a position I think is much closer to describing the sequencing of events and the purpose of why those events are near to each other. Notice in the post-trib rapture, radically, the second coming and the rapture occur at the very end of the tribulation period, the 7 years. And in this situation, they're right on top. In this model, they're right on top of one another. They're combined. I do think it's unfortunate that they're conflated, but I don't fault the ancient fathers who perhaps articulated the end time events this way, because when you look at the scriptures as a whole, comparing what you read about in the prophets, the details you're given in the book of Daniel, and then you jump into the Olivet Discourse that Yeshua gives us, and then you jump into Paul, and then you jump into the book of Revelation. Those are some of the major books. I know there are other books that include prophetic end-time details, but I'm just using the big ones at the moment. The Old Testament prophets, Daniel, Yeshua, Paul, and then the book of Revelation. If you lay all those out on the table and begin to line up all of your rapture events, and you step back and look at them from a kind of a large overview perspective, I think post-trib has got it right here, that we can expect some very tough times ahead as a church. I don't think we're going to be excused from this tough time period. Could we call that time period tribulation? Well, at some point in time, we do need to call it tribulation that we as Christians should experience. That's not to say that we won't experience trouble throughout our entire lives. That's kind of basic. That's kind of Christianity 101, is that you're going to suffer for being a Christian. But there's a specific time in which the writers predicted that there will be this intense persecution like never before and will never be equaled again. We're talking about the Great Tribulation. And so when we look at the post-trib rapture, we're talking about post-tribulation from, how do we say this? A rapture that comes after a tribulation. And if that tribulation is the Great Tribulation, then this is where I think the post-tribbers are making the most sense of the timing. When Yeshua gave the Olivet Discourse to his listeners at that day, the disciples, which now has been recorded for us, the general sense of Matthew 24, verse 29 states immediately after the tribulation of those days. And then he starts describing what appears to be a rapture. And this is where I think post-tribs have the most traction. This is where the pre-tribs just aren't reading the passage at face value. And so the face value reading of immediately after the tribulation of those days, there will be a rescue operation, a gathering. This makes the most sense of post-trib rapture. I like this about them. I wish they didn't conflate that rapture with Israel's salvation at the end of the 7th week, because they hold to a theology, that an interpretation that believes that Paul's trumpet in 1 Corinthians 15 is to be equated with John's 7th trumpet in the book of Revelation. And so because post-tribbers conflate those two trumpets, they then, and because they do see the 7th trumpet activities as being the end of the 7th week and the salvation of national Israel, then this forces them into a rapture that lays on top of Israel's salvation. So stated a different way, if you read through the Bible about rapture details, you'll usually come to the conclusion that resurrection, rapture, same event. Resurrection, rapture is something that happens after the tribulation. You'll also find that if you read through the Bible, that the 7th trumpet activities should correspond with the salvation of national Israel. And thus, if you then take the final step of interpreting Paul's last trump with John's 7th trumpet, then you have thus combined last trump rapture with seventh trump salvation of Israel, and the two become one event, and you're, bada bing, bada boom, you're a post-tribber. That's kind of the way it works. But post-trib rapturists believe the rapture will occur following the 7-year period known as Daniel's 70th week. And then the final view that we're going to be eventually giving more detail is the pre-wrath rapture, which is the view that I hold to. The pre-wrath rapture has a rapture that is post-tribulational, just like the post-tribbers say, but it's post-great tribulation. And the Great Tribulation is cut short by the rapture, which the rapture also initiates the day of the Lord. So the rapture is that separating event. What is the second coming? Well, the second coming is actually all of the events that are connected with the rapture and the salvation of Israel. So we can call that giant time period the second coming. Biblically, the name would be parousia. And there's only one of them, folks. There's only a single parousia. There's not two of them. Even though you see two arrows on my slide here, two downward pointing arrows, one at the pre-wrath rapture where it's touching the white arrow, and the second one on the right that's pointing down. That second arrow right there is referring to the events that are connected with the final salvation of Israel and the Battle of Armageddon. Both of those are those downward arrows. Specifically, if the downward arrow is the movement of Jesus from a heavenly position down towards earth, then the first black arrow on the left would be Jesus coming down to rescue his bride in rapture and resurrect, obviously. Resurrection comes first. Everyone knows that. So resurrection, then rapture. And then the second downward arrow is Jesus coming back to do battle against the Antichrist. But in all reality, in actuality, one day, I'm going to show you that as I zoom in on the day of the Lord activities and God's wrath and the second coming, that there are actually multiple times in between those two arrows where we find Jesus doing activities on planet Earth. Does he go back up to heaven and come back down? I'm not ready to say that just yet, but there are a lot of things that the Old Testament's prophesied concerning Israel that involve Jesus going to places, specifically in the Middle East where Israel's been hiding out, hiding out from the Antichrist persecution, where he needs to meet them basically face to face so that he can get them to understand who he truly is. And this will usher in him rescuing them. They mount a defense against Antichrist. There are a couple of campaigns in there. One we could label the Jerusalem campaign, another we could label the Jehoshaphat campaign, culminating in what we're going to label the Armageddon campaign. So JJA in that order. We'll talk about those in time. But for now, Prewrath, it's enough to say that Prewrath believes that we will be rescued post-tribulationally, but pre-wrath. So right in the middle there, we will go through persecution, great tribulation, at the hands of Antichrist, but not we will not have to go through the wrath of God. We're exempted from that. Pre-wrath rapturists believe the rapture will occur following the opening of the sixth seal of the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation, the church will experience severe persecution by the Antichrist, but will be snatched away before God begins to pour out his wrath during the day of the Lord. I'm just reading this part right here. Come on, make the little star. There we go. I'm reading that part so that you can understand. Okay, so let's go back over to my slide. Excursus 2, the rapture gathering fulfills Israel's covenant calling and includes all who are in Messiah. So I'm in this excursus. We're working from refuting pre-tribbers' objection to placing the church inside of the 7-year time period that they call the 7-year tribulation. They believe that Yeshua's Olivet Discourse excludes the church. They instead believe that when Jesus talked about the elect, that he was talking about national Israel or Israelites that come to faith in Jesus or something to that effect. I disagree with that pre-trib interpretation. Post-trib, by the way, gets it right, that the elect is either the church and Israel. And so I'm also working from that thesis that, or from the hypothesis that the elect in Yeshua's Olivet Discourse is a description of those who name the name of Messiah, namely the church, the elect, the bride. But ultimately, we can see that the mysterious aspect of bringing the church alongside of national Israel has resulted in the mysterious aspect of how God is going to protect his people and yet rescue Israel and yet bring them to salvation, while the church already enjoys corporate salvation. So there's some confusion that we need to kind of work through. So let's go down through, and I'll just show you by way of review just the headlines. We looked at fulfillment of Israel's covenant calling. The rapture is connected to promises made to national Israel way back when. That the rapture of the church is not disconnected from promises made to Israel. That's my point. Point number 2 that we already looked at. The rapture includes all who are in Messiah, unified elect. Thus, when God sends his son to rapture his bride, we have to remember that the bride is the bride includes remnant Israel, which is already nested within national Israel, but is the believing branches on the tree. By comparison, the unbelieving branches that have been broken off are laying on the ground. Paul tells us in Romans chapter 9, 10, and 11, specifically chapter 11, that these broken off branches, or perhaps bent back, depends on how you translate the exact Greek, bent back, broken back, bruised, we could even say. These branches can be brought back to life or brought back into a relationship with God if they place their faith in Messiah. They're already part of the national tree that's recognized as the cultivated olive tree, but they're in unbelief at the time that Paul was writing the letter. National, unbelieving, stumbling Israel. Well, the rapture is a rapture of the remnant of Israel that we call the church, but that just means it's a part of a harvest that is represented as the first fruits of a larger harvest. So here's another analogy that we find all the way back in the Tanakh. God operates on this principle of harvest. We see this in the Tanakh over and over again. God tells Israel, grow your crops. And when the harvest comes, first thing you need to do, Israel, is you need to collect a first fruit, a tithe. Take that small portion out, present it to me, and I will then look upon this tithe, this first fruit, and in symbolic fashion, I will accept the entire harvest and I will bless it, but I'll let you enjoy the larger part of it as a people group. I'll just take my tithe, give that to me, save that smaller part for me. That's a first fruits, and it represents a greater harvest that I also, God says, will bless, that I'll participate in. So in similar fashion, I believe it's very workable scenario that the rapture can be seen as a first fruits harvesting unto God, in which the greater harvest will be the salvation of national Israel at the end of the 7th week. When I say greater, I mean Paul's big thrust in his letters is to, at some points, is to explain to Gentile Christians that they've been included into the commonwealth of Israel, that they take their place alongside of believing Israelites now in real time because they've already placed their faith in Messiah. And so that's why I believe the salvation event that we call rapture will be connected with the salvation event that we're going to call second coming of Christ, or what people commonly call the second coming of Christ, a glorious return, where Jesus comes and finally saves national Israel and ultimately results in the destruction of Antichrist. Let's keep going. I don't want to spend too much time on review. We looked at this one last week. Covenant realization precedes wrath. And so what we started doing is we worked our way into a case study where there's a sequencing of events that's connected to this idea of resurrection, and then a resurrection from after a tribulation. So we could say tribulation first, then a resurrection or rescue, and then a pouring out of wrath. In a smaller picture, we could just focus on the rescue and then the wrath. But if we zoom out, we could actually see that there was tribulation that preceded the rescue. And indeed, it was the tribulation that prompted the need for a rescue. So we're into this case study of Isaiah 26, 20 through 21, which really, to get the full context, we backed up to verse 19. So we worked our way down through this. I'll read the verses for you, which read, "Come, my people, enter your homes and close your doors behind you. Hide for a little while until indignation runs its course. For behold, the Lord is about to come out from his place to punish the inhabitants of the earth for their wrongdoing." And what pre-wrathers like to do with this passage is believe that chiefly the prophets were writing to national Israel. There wasn't really a mystery of the Gentile inclusion in Israel just yet during the time when Isaiah penned these words. Did Isaiah know about the mystery of the Gentiles being brought into what we call the mystery of the gospel? Read Ephesians chapter 2 through 5 all over again. Did the national Israelites, including Isaiah, the writer of these words, did they know about the mystery of the Gentiles, the mystery of the gospel? Did they know that there were going to be Gentiles included? Well, if they would have understood God's promise to Papa Abraham a long time ago that through you all the nations of the earth will be blessed, through your seed Abraham, ultimately pointing to Messiah, King Messiah, as the seed, singular. But there's every reason to believe that it also involves the people of national Israel, Abraham's physical offspring, because there was that part of the plan as well. It wasn't just completely that God did everything through Jesus, but the spiritual seed of Abraham, namely Yeshua, gave birth to ultimately a people group that we now recognize as a church. But it was the national Israelites that bore those the physical offspring that was necessary to even bring Jesus into the world in the first place. So Jesus is Jewish, but Jesus gave birth to Jesus gave birth to the church, right? Or Jesus established the church. It wasn't Israel that established the church, is the point I'm trying to make. I think most Christians understand it. No one's going around saying that the church was established by Israel. The church was it's Jesus' bride. The bride is married to the bridegroom. So come my people here. The my people is our national Israelites. But since we now know with New Testament hindsight that when the Bible says my people, even in the Old Testament, we can now realize that if this is a prophecy that's looking at the future, like Isaiah's is, then we can now realize that my people can include Gentile believers if the context allows it. So come my people could now include the church, even though at the time that Isaiah wrote it, he might not have known. He might have known. I can't say for certain. I don't want to say that he definitely wasn't speaking of the church, but how much he articulated about that, again, there's that whole idea of mystery, God hiding information in the Old Testament only to be revealed in the coming of his son. So come my people here could be, come national Israelites, enter your rooms and close your doors behind you and hide for a little while until indignation runs its course. The Za'am in Hebrew, we're going to look at that in a moment. Or, come my people could include Gentile Christians who are part of the church, enter your rooms and close the doors behind you and hide for a little while. Hide here would then be represented as a rapture event that ultimately rescues them from the day of the Lord outpouring, which is spoken about in the lower verse there. The Lord is about to come out from his place to punish the inhabitants of the earth for their wrongdoings. Notice, even in this limited snapshot of Day of the Lord activities, you have to notice this or you're going to get lost. The Day of the Lord activities often included punishment against either Israel or against Israel's political enemies, sometimes both. Context demands what Day of the Lord, who's being punished during the Day of the Lord at the moment. But at least at this moment, we can see that the Lord is about to come out from his place and punish the inhabitants of the earth. This seems to be a reference not to Israelites so much as it's a reference to wicked surrounding nations who have historically persecuted God's people. Remember, Isaiah is writing historically during a time when the sieges of the Assyrians coming down and taking the people of Israel into captivity eventually led to the Babylonians coming down and taking Israel into captivity as well. So we had ultimately Israel being taken captive by foreign powers, and that's the context, the greater context of Isaiah's writing. So God punishing the evildoers of planet Earth would not need to be directly aimed at Israel. Their punishment was in the being carted off for their wickedness by the Gentile nations. That would be a day of the Lord punishment against Israel alone. But God always promised Israel, even though I punish you, I will not destroy you, because I've got covenant promises that include exalting my own name. So for my own name's sake, I can't destroy you, because I've made promises to you. And if I destroy you, then I'm going against my own promises, and I'm discounting my own integrity as a God, as a righteous God. I'm basically showing to the rest of the world that I'm incompetent, that it wasn't strong enough to save you, that I let a foreign power come and destroy you, and I orchestrated it and allowed it to happen. Therefore, I'm the one who's guilty of that. No, Israel, I'm going to punish you, but I'm not going to destroy you. But, Israel, listen up. Those evil nations that I used to capture you off and carry you off into captivity and punish you for your wicked doing, yeah, I let them do that. I orchestrated that. They were my instruments, right? Nebuchadnezzar was my hand of my sword. I think there are verses that describe this concept. So yes, God says to Israel, I actually pushed those wicked nations into a position to punish you. But since I didn't make covenants with them, nor their forefathers, oh yeah, I'm going to destroy them. They're headed for destruction, right? They're going to be gone someday. So the Lord is about to come out from his place to punish the inhabitants of the earth for their wrongdoings. But the wrongdoings here are not just the wrongdoings against Israel. In a limited sense it is, but ultimately it's wrongdoings against God himself. So we've got the Prewrath Interpretation, timing just before the wrath of God, that I did talk about earlier last week. And then I also talked about I think I talked about entry rooms, a Rapture Parallel with additional Isaiah 26 context. Because we talked about your dead will live, their corpses arrive, you lie in the dust. So we talked about how that there's resurrection there. Now I believe we're ready for indignation, the day of the Lord's wrath. So this topic that we're looking at right now is a theme that is all over the Tanakh. Primarily since the New Testament is read by Christians, and primarily since rapture is a topic that many Christians focus on, I think the topic of wrath of God, day of the Lord, plays a back seat in many churches and doesn't get talked about a lot. But we're going to look at it somewhat tonight. Indignation, the day of the Lord's wrath. How is this connected to the rapture itself? So let's start looking at this topic, indignation, the day of the Lord's wrath. I wrote this. The indignation, the za'am in Isaiah, is consistently associated with the prophets with divine judgment against the wicked. You can compare from Isaiah 13:5 to 13, Zephaniah 1:14 through 18. I go on to say that in pre-wrath, this corresponds precisely to the day of the Lord, which is triggered after the rapture. Okay, so what I need to do is pull up a chart for you real quick. Okay, this one will kind of accomplish what I'm looking for. Let me pull out my little markers. So we're talking about looking at the events and sequencing of the 70th week of Daniel. And what we're talking about is building up to this idea of the Great Tribulation here, which will then, let me redraw that. The Great Tribulation here, which will then lead into the day of the Lord, which is here. And so we can see that this is basically the midpoint of the week, the arrow pointing down there, which kicks off the Great Tribulation, right? So we're talking about the 7 years down here. But what we're anticipating in the pre-wrath model is that the Great Tribulation itself is going to be cut short by this activity up here called the coming of the Son of Man, date unknown. So we can call that the rapture, which occurs sometime in association with the sixth seal, signs in the sky. That will be the event that is one of the last signs that we will know as Christians that the Lord's return is really imminent. At that moment, we know that the tribulation is being cut short. The tribulation against Christians is being cut short. The tribulation against Israel might feel like it continues on because they're not rapture ready at the moment when the sixth seal sign happens. They won't yet believe in Jesus. Some of them might at that moment, but the majority of them will have already gone into hiding per Yeshua's warning at the midpoint of the week. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by your armies, get up and get out. And also confirmed by John in Revelation chapter 12, this place in the wilderness that's prepared for Israel for 1,260 days, beginning at the midpoint of the week and going to the end. So germane to our study right now, what we're going to be getting into is, as we're looking at these Day of the Lord activities, which kick off with the seals, they kick off with the trumpets and the bowls, right? Which I guess you could say the seventh seal, we can put that in there, but not the first six. The Day of the Lord itself is the parousia. The Day of the Lord is the coming of Christ, the presence of Christ felt on planet Earth. That's really the parousia. The focal point of the Day of the Lord, however, is judgment against God's enemies, primarily the evil beast empire that Satan will be controlling under his puppet Antichrist at that point in time. So as we go back over to our study, we need to begin to locate this indignation that God himself is going to pour out, this wrath against wickedness. And we begin to realize that we believers, we must be rescued from this wrath. Going back over that chart for a second, this rescue is this arrow right there. We must be rescued from this Day of the Lord activities, or protected through it, in case I'm wrong, right? Let's just say the post-tribbers are right, and that we actually go through the Day of the Lord. Either way, we're either rescued or we're protected, one way or the other. Right now I'm going with the position that says we're rescued from it. But remember, I said I could be wrong, and if I'm wrong, then we'll have to just be sheltered through it. But either way, we'll be protected. So going back over, either way, what we cannot mistake is that this is wrath poured out against God's enemies, not poured out against us. So don't get confused. God's not punishing us. The whole point of the matter is that if we name the name of Messiah, that we are exempted from this type of wrath. And here's the point I'm kind of working up to. Eventually, the Bible is going to tell us or describe events that should equate to this retribution from God being poured out on living enemies. Day of the Lord activity. I call this eschatological wrath. This is a term that I picked up from other teachers, and I'm distinguishing eschatological wrath from eternal wrath. And so eschatological wrath means end of days wrath, 70th week of Daniel wrath. If you want me to switch terminology to 70th week of Daniel wrath, so that you understand that I'm trying to locate wrath inside of, let me go back to my chart again, inside of the Day of the Lord. Let me erase some of these for a second. I'm talking about this stuff right here. The Day of the Lord, the seventh seal, which unleashes the seventh trumpets, which then the seventh trumpet unleashes the seven bowls. That's what I mean by Day of the Lord wrath, wrath of God, Day of the Lord, 7th week of Daniel, Day of the Lord. And from my understanding of post-trib theology, they interpret Paul promising that we're not, but we don't have to go through this wrath as wrath that is reserved for unrepentant sinners, and that will be meted out by God on the end of what do we call the Great White Throne Judgment, at the very end of history, even post-millennium, and sinners are resurrected, and they all stand before the Great White Throne, and God gives them the eternal judgment that they deserve, and they're cast into the lake of fire eternally. Excuse me. That is the type of wrath I believe that Paul is not focusing on in his letter at 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 9. And last time I mentioned Joel Richardson as someone who holds to that particular view. And then I think I said something to the effect of, Joel, you ought to know better, that Paul's not talking about that. And I want to offer an apology if it implies that I believe that Joel Richardson is teaching some type of deception. That's not the type of rebuke I'm making to Mr. Richardson, Joel, my brother. I'm not trying to say, Joel, you're teaching error, brother. You ought to know better. What kind of nonsense are you teaching? You need to repent, brother. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is I've studied under Joel Richardson, and he is a solid exegete. He's got some really solid theology. And he studies his Bible well. He's got some really strong interpretations. And that's why when he comes to the interpretation of 1 Thessalonians 5:9 as not 70th week of Daniel wrath, but end of days, eternal separation from God wrath, people who've lived and died and resurrected now in order to be judged, that type of wrath. So final Bema Seat judgment wrath, eternal separation from God type of wrath. That's why when I said that about Joel Richardson last week, I'm trying to say, come on, brother, you're a stronger interpreter than that. That's what I mean by you should know better. Meaning I've studied under you before. You've got extremely strong exegetical powers. So I'm wondering why you're falling for this kind of weakness, why you're not seeing that. Just read the first and second Thessalonian letters and look at the context, both the immediate context, the larger context. It's not about this end of days wrath, meaning eternal separation from God in the lake of fire, that type of wrath. That's not what Paul's telling them that they are exempted from. He's talking about the day of the Lord in the immediate verses prior, leading up to verse 9. Start at verse 1, work your way down to verse 9, and you'll see that he's talking about the day of the Lord there. So I wanted to issue that kind of public apology, if indeed that was the way that some of you might have interpreted what I said last week. So I apologize. Let's go on. Indignation. Let's keep talking about this. So if we're right in Prewrath that this corresponds precisely to the day of the Lord, which is triggered after the rapture, then I go on to say that this means that God's people are protected from the day of the Lord, not from tribulation in general, but from the specific outpouring of his wrath, just as Isaiah 26 describes. So God says to those who know him in the person of Messiah, come and hide. And the hidden aspect would correspond with those who are rapture ready. However, I mentioned last week that, and let me back up a bit to show you this, that hide, let me see where it is. Enter your rooms, hide. Okay, here we go, down here. I wanted to highlight this too. Within the context of Isaiah's prophecy, since he's speaking to national Israel, and if we are to understand now that, going back to my slide, if we are to understand that at the moment when the Great Tribulation is cut short by the resurrection and the rapture, the coming of the Son of Man, date unknown, if at that moment national Israel is actually hiding in the desert like they were told to do, then they're not going to be raptured. Instead, the come, hide my people hide in your rooms until the indignation runs its course, represents, now, then I can go over, however, in my opinion, the warning to flee from Jerusalem mentioned in the Olivet Discourse passages, paralleled with Israel's flight from the dragon in Revelation 12:6, as well as 13:17, would indeed qualify as a sort of pre-rapture earthly concealment. So in that case, in that short context, we would then say that the come my people and hide represents go and hide, not just from the persecution of Antichrist if you can, but stay in hiding until I, God, pour out my 70th week of Daniel wrath upon the evil Antichrist's empire, the eighth beast empire that will be in control of the world's resources at that time. Hide while not only I pour out my wrath, but hide from Antichrist's wrath if you can. But if that were the case, then going back to the verse, if that were the way we would read it, then this verse up here that says your dead will live, your corpses will rise, you who lie in the dust awake and shout for joy. This is like verse 19 that you're seeing right here. It would mean that this is a kind of a preview of what is to come. Your dead will live, their corpses will rise, you who lie in the dust awake and shout for joy. It would mean that this resurrection event that's being described here cannot be for those in national Israel who don't know Jesus yet, because they're not going to experience a resurrection at that moment. The resurrection, which we're going to label the first resurrection, per John's notes in the book of Revelation, is exclusively for those who are in Messiah.